Hi everyone, welcome to the first video in the conversation series. So I'm Claire Jacques, a member of the commercial technology team, and with me is my colleague Bryn Harris. So this is the first of a three-part series on handling disruption in supply agreements, so goods and services, and we're going to take a look at the steps you can take when disruption leads to difficulty in either supplying goods or to receive or pay for that supply.
Thanks, Claire. The conversation series is going to be covering a wide range of commercial law topics. We're especially interested in matters and topics that are live for you. So if you have any ideas or suggestions for future videos, please do get in touch. But Claire, let's move on to the business at hand. Can you tell me, please, what disruption means in this context?
Sure, Bryn. So when we're talking about disruption, what we mean is where one party becomes unable to meet its obligations in some way. So we have a really good example right now. The COVID-19 pandemic is extremely disruptive. Businesses are coming out of lockdown, they're understaffed, or their staff are furloughed, and in particular, cash flow is constrained. But if we're thinking beyond the immediate situation right now, I think you'll agree it seems likely that the current disruption is going to be a medium-term problem with a recession looming, dare I say it?
Well, I do agree, and sadly, I agree that a recession does look likely. Um, so let's look at obligations in a contract or warranties, as well as payment terms. Now, if I'm a supplier and because of the disruption, I can't meet my obligations, let's say I can't meet deliveries because I don't have sufficient staff. Difficult situation, I'm going to need help. What are my options towards my customers?
Okay, so the starting point is check the type of contract you have, or indeed, if you have a contract. It might be straightforward, so you'll be able to see where you filed your goods or services agreement that, surprise, surprise, has been signed by both parties. But don't panic failing that. You also want to check the small print on invoices or look at the bottom of purchase orders for references to terms and conditions, and then try and figure out whose standard T's and C's it is. Even a series of emails or conversations might form a written contract. But even if there's nothing in writing, don't forget you might also be able to imply a contract by conduct.
Okay, well, let's assume we're lucky. There's a nice written contract signed amazingly by both parties. What should I be looking for in that contract?
Okay, Bryn, so first of all, you want to look for the specific wording on supplier obligations or warranties. You see, you want to check the steps you need to take to meet your commitments. So are they absolute obligations? You shall provide the services? Or actually, is there a specific standard that you need to meet? So you might be familiar, I'm sure you are familiar with the words using reasonable endeavours or best endeavours to provide the services.
So I am indeed familiar with that wording. Um, Looking at it at face value, it's not entirely clear what the difference is between those two terms. So can you tell us a bit about the difference between best and reasonable endeavours?
Well, you're right, they sound very similar, particularly if they're in small print, but the subtle change in wording to the two does make a difference. So if we take reasonable endeavours, this is thumbs up for the supplier because that's the lowest standard to meet. You just need to take one reasonable course of action. So for example, if you've got to deliver goods by a certain date, your delivery company isn't available, you find another one. You don't need to sacrifice your own commercial interest though, and you don't need to go to extra cost. If we come to best endeavours though, it's stricter because you have to take all steps in your power, even if this costs you extra money. But fortunately, in this current climate, you still don't have to go so far as to put yourself out of business.
Okay, good. So I know to look out for best endeavours requirements. But going
Mhm.
back to what you said, you mentioned absolute obligations. Now, what do I do if the contract says that I shall deliver the goods, regardless of the standard of efforts that I make?
Well, Bryn, it's straightforward. You just have to do what it says. It's an absolute obligation, and if you don't provide the services, you don't deliver the goods by a certain date, then there are going to be consequences. Firstly, if the customer is suffering loss, incurring costs as a result of breaking that clause, then they'll have a right to claim damages for their losses. They might even have a right to terminate the contract.
Okay, I must say this is all sounding quite legal, quite daunting. It looks like we're lining up a potential expensive legal dispute. How can we avoid escalating to that situation?
Well, yes, firstly, really, we want to say don't panic. What we're doing at the moment is just understanding what the legal rights and options that a party can rely on and really pinning down what the standard is. I think the starting point, though, is trying to find a compromise that works for both parties. I mean, I think you'll agree it's challenging times during this pandemic for many businesses. And actually, this is an opportunity perhaps to foster some mutual understanding and cooperation. I mean, it could be really beneficial to be flexible at a time like this. Because I think if we can stand together now in these challenging times, it could really bode well for the future relationship of both parties.
Yeah, as you say, there are two parties and it takes two to tango. So let's now flip it around and look at this from the perspective of the customer.
Mhm.
Let's say I'm a customer with cash flow difficulties and I find that I can't pay for orders. And what are my options in this tricky situation?
Yeah, so you go back to the contract again. And I think the first important thing to say is if you're paying for goods and you have an obligation to pay for goods, that's a key condition that's going to the heart of the contract.
Hmm?
So that's important because if you break this term, it means it's very likely that then the supplier has got grounds to terminate the contract. And again, if they've incurred costs, to be able to recover those costs and losses. Unless, of course, they could rely on another provision like a force majeure clause. And I'll talk about that a bit more with you at our next video. But for now, we just want to look at what the options are in the contract. There could already be some flexibility in the wording. So you kind of want to look out for clauses that let you reduce or even delay your orders. And perhaps you might be able to agree a variation, a change to the contract or a waiver. I think the final thing to say is don't forget that missed payments are going to incur interest, whether or not that's written into the contract. So I think the final thing about this is to say, have that conversation early on. It's very likely to avoid being in a situation where the other party is going to try to terminate, that in fact you could negotiate a better outcome.
Yeah, well, we're in the business of trying to find better outcomes, so I very much agree with that. I think that takes us, Claire, to the end of our allotted time. Do you think you could put in a nutshell the main points from our conversation today?
Yes, definitely. So, firstly, check the wording in the contract about the standard that the parties need to meet, or the party who has the obligation needs to meet. Secondly, check out the other rights and options in the contract. Perhaps there's some flexibility already there. And thirdly, have the conversation early. Be pragmatic, be reasonable. So thanks for your time today, Bryn, and thanks to everyone for listening. Do look out for the next video in this series. We're going to be talking about force majeure clauses, which are quite topical at the moment. But if you want to know more about our virtual general counsel service, check out the link below, or even better, get in touch with one of us.